Wow, this is a thrill for me, actually. To see 4 former students who I've known since I've been in the school back tonight, but not to show student work, to show professional work, which I think is fantastic. Money J prepared an extraordinary sheet for me describing the 4 of them, which I'm actually going to read, because in fact, it's an incredible, half the words are incomprehensible to me, but I think they might mean something to all of you. So we have the Universal Assembly Unit. 4 Diploma 6 graduates from the last 4 years. So in fact, Ollie sitting next to me is the oldest, maybe not in age, but in graduation. Graduated in 2011. Sammy is next to Ollie, graduated in 2012. Will, a little bit further down, 2013. And Zhan is the youngster of the group, just graduating last year. The 4 of them have come together, but what I'm going to do first of all is just give you a little bit of background into each one of them, and the project that they carried out at school, and a little bit how they've moved forward. So Ollie, sitting next to me, winner of the Posner Drawing Prize at the AA for his Gravity 1 project that choreographed military airspace in remote Australia. Teaches media studies on animation and video game interface programs like Unity. Does it mean anything? Right, excellent, right. Next to him is Samantha, I know her as Sammy, a speculative honors-nominated project, should have won, on how we can reimagine landscape as a supercomputer. She also worked for ScanLab, and her work has been featured in Tank magazine for 3D scanning garments. To the left of Sammy is Will. I kind of want you to know them. I was joking with them before saying it's a bit like One Direction, so you have to get to know your group, yeah? So Will, to the left, the youngest looking of the 4, Will, the title of his diploma project was Off Grid. Project was a room-scale installation that explored a new form of underground decentralized communication network within Mexico. After graduation, he worked for United Visual Artists, a multidisciplinary London-based practice that works between art, performance, and installation. And finally, Zhan. Zhan, who just graduated last year, his diploma project on the Lunar Economic Zone, imagined a technotopia for lunar mineral extraction in China that would put them at the forefront of the rare earth mineral industry. Is that a good summation, Zhan? Excellent. But you guys will know him probably much more for the fact that his drawings were featured on the cover of Blueprint magazine as one of the best graduate projects in the class of 2014, and I think probably the best cover that Blueprint have ever done. The 4 of them collectively have come together to put together a practice, and I think which should give kind of, if you'll bear with me for just a moment, Money J and Brett have put together, I think, what's an extraordinary lecture series of young graduates. Called What's Next, showing that you do not have to go to David Chipperfield, Rem Koolhaas, or Herzog and de Meuron for an education post-education. That there are other alternative forms of practice, and I'm thrilled that the 4 of them are working together. It's a kind of great treat for me as someone who watched them progress through the school, now to watch them practice such on, I think, right on the edge of practice, which I'll let the 4 of you carry on at this point. So welcome to the Universal Assembly Unit, or as I know them, Ollie, Sam, Will, and Zhan.
Thanks, Chris. That was very. You took a lot of my shoulders basically, so I don't need to introduce anybody anymore. Just did that. That's fine. As the elderly. They pass it on to me, kind of trying to say about how we kind of came together in a way, and what happens with us, and how we all kind of got ourselves as on through the river, basically all together, 1 year by another one in this. We kind of overlapped. I started with Sammy in the same unit, different years. Then Sammy with Will, and Will with Zhan. This kind of brought us all together in a way. Everything basically started on a Monday, as today, where we set it up that Mondays is our meeting days. No matter what happens, Monday night, 7 p.m. latest, we meet in the studio, which back then was one of each other's flats, and trying to share ideas, basically. We didn't have any kind of plan about professional work in a way. We just want to kind of share, bounce ideas in a way and develop projects. But that somehow emerged into a studio in a way. I studied at sometimes kind of become very, how should I say, official once we incorporated as a limited company. We found a little studio in Dalston, where we're based, and where we kind of still meet Mondays and more than that in a way now. So as I like to introduce them, I will say it: Sammy on vocals, Will on drums, Zhan on guitar, and myself on keyboards though. But yeah,
You're mixing.
Sorry?
You mix.
Well, a bit. We put a lot around a lot of kind of a visual feed of what we are kind of doing, what we kind of come up with, where we come from. And one of the main things which started us and also wrapped up all our previous academic work was our student projects, which kind of came up together in a showreel. And that was, in a way, to highlight our subtitles, which is a space animation studio, and trying to articulate the fact that we did animation as a way to prototype space rather than a filmmaking methodology of communicating ideas, I think. And so we'll go through that. I think we could start with that. Basically, the showreel was the point where we said, okay, what are we actually doing? Because we have lots of projects, a lot of experiments through that. And what do we kind of build up on together and how we define ourselves? So we looked on our work, basically trying to identify more precisely what direction we go. And then out of the big pot of experiments and tests we are doing, there was one which was basically playing with a simple motion tracking sensor, as this one I have here on my desk in a way, and kind of visualizing the movement of a finger. It was strictly an exploration of media, trying to identify various ways of taking the movement as an input to drive visual context. From here, playing with this, we end up, you never know where to place this stuff. Because you end up saying like, okay, what do you do with them? But we decided to let them flow out basically and let them kind of stack up on top of them as a way of expressing what we're looking into in order to see where we're gonna contextualize them. And we were approached by by two musicians, Rosie and Mimi, which one of them is a piano player, the other one is a DJ. And we thought, well, that's a great, actually, platform to start this project onto, because we are curious about looking at the piano player's fingers as a way of not to just generate the audio or the sound for it, but also to drive the visual on it. So the same movement, the same sync of her fingers basically drive the two elements of them. And this is a video of the first demo day we ran together. Yeah, so as I said, the main thing was to look at the gestures of music, basically, and just the visual, and that in a way to kind of end up creating this animation space that we were probably discussing about and thinking about in a way. Will, do you want to talk about the meltdown stuff?
Yeah, so after this first little collaboration, we then went on to work with Mimi and Rosie on their show for Meltdown Festival. So it's based in the Royal Festival Hall, and we basically wanted to try and stitch together this kind of coherent audio, sort of visual feast storyline between basically the fragments and memories of their carnet de voyage, so this travelling notebook that they'd set up as their kind of audio piece. So with these kind of sound and visuals working together and having this sort of dialogue, our intention was to kind of create this immersive environment, which you can see kind of in this diagram up here. Essentially, the idea is to try and create this volumetric space where we have these dual projections, both front and back, to try and sort of capture the performance. And the idea was that Mimi and Rosie become as much a part of the performance and the visuals themselves, rather than the kind of motion graphics just becoming sort of a piece over the top of the audio. So, I mean, we worked also with the film director Mike Figgis. We used a lot of his footage, which was primarily on the rear screen, and the motion graphics that we generated were these sort of line drawings which exaggerated and abstracted a lot of the kind of elements that were coming out of the footage, as well as the audio from Mimi and Rosie. So I think if you can, go on, please. Where the 3D audio, the 3D visuals are kind of responding to the audio itself. So you see a lot of the motion graphics and stuff becomes very almost interactive. So we found that Mimi and Rosie were actually starting to bounce off the visuals themselves. So it wasn't just a one-way street. It was very much kind of a to and fro, where they realized that certain things that they were doing were starting to create certain responses with the visuals, and that kind of started to really feed back into the music and the performance. So that was something that we kind of both started to get quite excited about. So Oliviu wants to talk a bit more about that.
Well, basically we were carrying on the idea of the space animation as literally as we could describe it. It was one way of communicating it to them as, let's say, a client in this case. But it was also the way of trying to dynamize the space, but not just in a linear way of you have an animation which you play and that's it, that traces the space, but how you have this loop feedback which is in real time. And the real time is one of the main components of what we are looking into. And we do believe in the kind of art of cinematography in a way, but it's not something which we want to focus on. I think we care more about what happens when you can build up a real-time pipeline and you can run all those emotions throughout that pipeline, or that kind of, you build that pipeline as a generative of emotions, basically. And this was part of the show when basically we pre-scanned the artists, and this was just another component which was added onto this multi-layered space animation which was going on the stage in a way. So this was probably something the video before in a way was basically responding to the trumpet of Mike Figgis, which was playing trumpet, and kind of getting the movement from the sound of the trumpet. Now it just gets the movement from my voice, I think. And, yeah, that's kind of it about it. But yeah, we should move onwards, I think, in the next project.
Yeah. So in this next one, sort of carrying on from Meltdown and this idea of using 3D scanning as a way to digitize the body and recontextualize it. So earlier this year, we did a series of fashion editorials for Tank magazine. And so the first one was sort of at a time when there was this really big hype about, 3D scanning yourself and having a miniature version which you could put on your desk or give to your grandmother. And which sort of had the output of these very rigid and expressionless poses, just based on the fact that the scanner required about 15 minutes to complete that scan, so you have to stand still for that entire time. And then so, in the context of that, and then also on the other end, you have the really generic virtual ready-made, which is kind of this digital stock model, which comes preloaded with a stock animation. And it's sort of set in a T-pose. So for this fashion shoot, we kind of we had this idea of putting the models, positioning them together so that they were intentionally very difficult to animate, or so their hands and their legs would be stuck together, so that when you would rig them and animate them, they would start to almost break away of their constraints, these kind of digital constraints. So you have the kind of polygons that bind them together become stretched and pulled apart. And also kind of scanning them with the surrounding environment or with inanimate objects and props in which, so for example here, a wall falls down and you're left with the imprint of that body, or wherever the body comes into contact with an object and it becomes separated, you sort of leave these trails behind. So it was kind of funny because during the shoot, everything was set up like a normal fashion shoot. So you had the stylist, the hairstylist, clothing stylist, and everything was kind of redirected around the scanner so that they would have to come over and check whether they could bring out the black sequin dress, whether it would actually be seen. And I think part of this, part of the editorial is we wanted to keep it very raw and glitchy because a lot of these digital artifacts, they only appear within that kind of digital world. And we sort of wanted to highlight that and to kind of celebrate it in a way. And so, and then also the hair was just, there was only a particular hairstyle that would actually show up, otherwise it would completely disappear. And there couldn't be too much hair gel either. But I quite like how you kind of get the eyelashes, the hair, the phrase of the dress all start to become like one language. And then for the second shoot that we did, we sort of took the human body out of the equation altogether, and just explored 3D scanning the the clothes and just capturing those as digital assets to be recontextualized, and in this case to be animated and turned into kind of living characters. So the context of this story was set in a future where clothes are living biofabrics. And so essentially they're a second skin, they're sensitive to your body, to moisture and temperature, but also that they have characteristics, that they have temper tantrums, that they kind of have mood swings. And I think for us, we sort of wanted to concentrate more on that behavioral aspect, the way that they acted or misbehaved, because the design of them themselves is, they were 3D scans, so they're 2014. But it was less about how they looked, more about how they acted and how we could kind of capture that movement within the still. So this was kind of this fictional future laboratory, which could have been a headquarters for this fashion label. Cool, and then if we just show the animation.
Oh God. So for the animation bit, we thought, to complete the narrative of these creatures in their lab environment, we would imagine these creatures in their natural habitat and how they behave. And the movements are generated from the stills that are almost like a caption of their mid-movement. And then we reimagined the landscape around these movements. And instead of making them like photorealistic or like the 3D assets, they're quite abstract and digitized, and also they react to the movement of these creatures moving through the landscape. And I think that kind of with the lab, these creatures in the lab, they complete the whole story of this project.
Cool.
So, laying on the same principle of the 3D scanning in a way of capturing data, we were looking like, we end up actually didn't look actually, it was totally like triggered by collaboration with Foxtel Studio we had and the textile designer, Teresa, which they approached us. Teresa is doing amazing cloth patterns, but she's using sound to generate the pattern of the clothing, ending up with these kind of binaural
those sort of instructions.
Exactly,
for
black and
jacquard.
white. Yeah, 1 and 0 kind of instruction for the jacquard to print them. But there wasn't, we didn't want to dive into the sound that much, but we tried to see how can we interpret the data in another way, and how can we couldn't scan it, which we'd have wanted to, but you can't get there, so we decided to kind of simulate the cloth behavior, because we found the project was based actually on Bond Street. It is based on Bond Street, it's even now it's up. Bond Street has a huge history in terms of cloth and textile design in a way, and we wanted to kind of pick up on that in a way. We, of course, coming from a project which was 3D scanning textiles and clothing, we said, okay, great, let's 3D scan it again, not really, maybe we do something else with it. So we started looking at the behavior of the cloth, basically what's happening with the cloth, not the geometry of it, but where's the point where it breaks, does it break, does it fall, doesn't fall, what's happening with that in a way. And we end up starting with basic simulations of cloth in a way, and having a mothball, drawing cloths on it, and trying to get in a way a sense of what the cloth is doing. And this was the point where we end up nurturing the idea of creating this creature of Bond Street, which is a creature of cloth, it's a character which represents all this clothing history as a representative or as a way to illustrate in a way this cloth behavior. And the project has a strange, initially it was a building, right? So we got the building as given, which is this one here. And we said, well, that's great. We want to do something in the building. I want to do something inside the building in a way. How can we put stuff in the building? How can we animate the interior of the building? But the response was very clear from the client side, under a big no, because this thing needs to be up for 3 years. And nobody will do maintenance for projectors, for whatever lighting system you want to do in that building. So then we end up having two elements. One of them being a print, which solves everybody's problems. and that goes in the facade and aligns with the requirements of the council. And then, of course, waiting for that for 2 weeks of planning, applications, and all that. It was an interesting, actually, take on it, because, yes, we come from architectural school in a way. It was interesting to kind of say, okay, so even going media arts, you end up dealing with council planning applications. That's fine. But what kind of stopped us more upon it, or what was the biggest time we invested into it, was basically the interactive side of this creature. Because as said, once you have it on the streets existing as a print, but that's just a placeholder for the creature basically, which lives online, lives on the internet, lives on the kind of like the fish in a tank basically. It's something developed to live in a digital medium, and you can find it in a digital medium. So we developed this interactive piece which works a bit like this. This basically takes it should take, yeah. So this thing basically, it interacts and starts moving according to the position of the mouse you have. So we said, okay, you have it there, it lives online, but what can you do with it in a way? Once it represents the textile, we use the same kind of black and white information that go into the jacquard, but we didn't use it as information card, as data card basically, but we used it as a black and white alpha channel to get in a way the transparency of the textiles. And there was one way of kind of bringing all the previous exploration of the textile designer into it. But then of course was to bring the colors and the joy of this creature which lives back there. And you can see it right here basically, like playing with the cursor. And do you have the sound on it? I think you're muted.
You might get all the sound from the website.
Okay, maybe it doesn't get the sound. Yeah, so it has basically the sound is this. Basically, as you move your mouse around back and forth, you play with it, you make it spin, you kind of give momentum to the entire creature. At the same time, you have audio feedback on that, and it's funny when we are having like a double screen and you go very, very far in the screen, the values go super high, so the sound goes extremely like super high. Like this is half of it in a way. But then it's also when you hover over it in a way, it
chills out.
Yeah, it behaves like a cat. It starts purring in a way. It's kind of a way of affection which gives you back something that just done that. But yeah, it's a play toy in a way. But it's was the point of saying it. Okay, this is the entire feedback we give to that building. This thing lives inside the building. But then dislocated everything to the online medium and the online space.
But I also think it's worth mentioning that because it was quite an interesting collaboration. As Teresa, most of the output of her work is something which is very tactile, and for us to work with her to create something which was a sort of using digital media to be an interpretation of her work, it wasn't we didn't want to necessarily recreate the tactility or what the actual physicality of her textiles gives us, but it was more what could we use digital media for, like how could it add another real-time dimension that her fabrics couldn't necessarily do. So yeah, that was.
It does. If you wonder, I mean, if you might read it, well, maybe we should. Yes, I'm up on that. We're a new studio. Actually, I was even thinking today. I think we kind of sum up 1 year since we start kind of building stuff together. But it's about probably 6 months, which is not even 6 while we start running commercially in a way. And though we are read as an interactive multimedia studio, there is a heavy kind of attention we pay to the architectural and the spatial aspect of it. I mean, even in this project, in a way, yes, it is a print on a facade, but then looking at the facade and trying to camouflage your artwork into the facade was something that, yeah, we stumbled over in a way and trying to balance it right in a way. I mean, yes, you do have the ornaments of the building. Yes, you do have all these vibrant kind of colors of it. And how do you look at them? And how do you look at the urban space, the urban environment which is in front of this building, which probably multimedia artists would take it for granted in a way.
Well, I think we sort of saw like the main site for this project was the web-based project.
Yeah.
That was like where it really came to shine, and it didn't have those kind of physical constraints that we had on site, and so we didn't. That sort of began, I suppose, a series of projects in which we considered them being multi-platform, that you didn't necessarily have to have, a proposal that just exists in one place, but you could propose something which exists as an installation, but also was a website, which also was an app, and just kind of everywhere.
Build on that from there.
On any kind of platform, but.
Yeah.
Okay. Should we move on?
Yeah.
So I mean, an earlier prototype of kind of this way of working is this project Unstable Landscapes, and it's kind of talking about a landscape, the kind of landscapes that exist all around us, but that you can't really see them, you can't really feel them, you don't really kind of have any kind of real kind of contact or interaction with them beyond kind of your screen, essentially. So I'm talking about things like GPS and cell phone networks and things, and for us it's a way of it's about treating these data sets. So like here we've got, this is essentially a feed of a GPS stream basically that's coming in, and it's understanding a way of working that you can start to design in these data sets. So what we've got here. In this particular example, we took the live feed of a GPS stream from a satellite, and essentially you have the number of satellites are feeding the stability of this landscape, and you begin to kind of read it like a landscape, and you read its reliability. So if there are more satellites connected, this thing appears stable and calm, and you can really kind of trust it. If there are less satellites connected, or maybe there are only, they're kind of really low on the horizon, the accuracy which you get from the accuracy number, which is this HDOP number, basically starts to affect the rate of flicker and how mountainous it looks. So from understanding what's making this landscape do certain things, you can start to really kind of design inside of it. So things like using a GPS jammer to jam the landscape, and spoofing landscapes. I think on the far screen you can see a small little test basically is just spoofing a like Google Maps app into thinking you're in a completely different location than you are. So they're standing in Regent's Park and it actually thinks you're in the middle of the Thames. So all these things, it's about sort of subverting and manipulating bits of information before people kind of get to it. It's another kind of, a good story is another way of looking at it is like the tube network and stuff like that. In London, you get these huge groups of people that kind of stand outside because it's the last point at which they're going to be able to send off that last text or whatever it is before they actually go down into these blackout zones. So you can, once you start to play with these invisible landscapes, start to curate and kind of manipulate the way that people kind of walk and behave in spaces. So it doesn't stop there. You get things like design starting to affect like the building fabric of architecture and the shapes and forms of things, just through manipulating these invisible kind of worlds of data, basically. And it's like similar to the Bond Street stuff. It's about trying to like place these sites not just in the physical, but also in the virtual through multiple forms. And this kind of, I don't know if we want to go on to talk about data now, but it's basically this idea of our understanding of place and location and how you can kind of start to design in it led on to another project, at Datum Festival. And the Datum Explorer. Now, the Datum Explorer is located in this forest down here, which is in Sussex. And again, it was about creating a multi-platform piece that you experience both physically, so when you're on the site, through your phone, through the web, and through live projection as well. And it was really about exploring these opportunities for intervention through these parallel worlds, both the physical and the virtual.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's worth kind of mentioning that the conversation about the digital landscape and how, you know, we sort of value working in that kind of environment is sort of, it was a conversation that started at the AA and started in DIP 6 and something that we continue. You know, it's you know, where we start to use the documentation and also the spatial data as tools in which to design with. And also we sort of place a value on it and as being almost as important or more important than the actual physical kind of stuff that makes up a site, so, you know, like the dirt in the grass. But yeah, so Datum Explorer was really this project that could explore how we took those spatially mapped sites and turn them into 3D interactive environments that you could experience across a physical installation, across a web-based app, and that sort of didn't necessarily tie itself to one site, let's say. So we kind of initially started with a terrestrial LiDAR scan of the site, in which to, you know, capture a very millimeter accurate digital version of it. And this could allow us to sort of address the space and address the level of interactivity we would have in it. And then as well, it just kind of became this resource in which we could put into a 3D kind of real-time engine.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what Ollie has over on the screen there is so that's the forest in which we could place a camera viewpoint anywhere within there, and then be able to put a projector back in that forest, and then it sort of update in real time. So it just became this live test bed in which we could constantly, you know, build within, I suppose.
Sort of like a cheating way of doing projection mapping, really. You can just move the camera around all the time constantly if you've got it in the wrong place.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, but I mean, it's, yeah, one of them was a way of using the tool as a kind of help yourself do an installation out of that. But then was also, again, carrying it on the same direction, the same previous project, or the geolocation data that Will was talking about. This was something that we said, okay, we are approaching a multi-platform kind of experience in this thing in a way. And once we were aware that in one way a digital installation or digital app or whatever digital ends up or most of the times when it ends up being on the screen ends up being very singular or something that you explore very singularly. But then you end up having an installation, or if you bring that digital element into the physicality of things and you really you bring it to life in a way, and that's something that ends up being explored more collectively. And there was a point where we find, okay, that's an interesting way of looking at space, basically. You have an individual space, which is very much between your eyes and your screen, and then you have a collective space which really explored that kind of side around. And we tied it we put it very, I mean, yeah, we linked the project very tight to the site. I mean, there's the reason why Will was mentioning about the forest is not accidentally in a way, because the app is changing according to location in a way. I mean, this was a very quick sketch test we did at the beginning before developing everything, where we said, okay, in one morning, actually myself was traveling between all these points, from down here, British Museum, up north, then coming back to the studio. And I kind of built up this little app which was kind of responding to the location I am. So I said, okay, when I'm home, I want to have the 3 cubes. When I'm in the studio, I want to have the 3 cubes, basically. Other than that, I'm off the grid. The app doesn't know where I am, in a way. And there was the same thing with I mean, this thing, we brought it into Datum Explorer, because Datum Explorer, yes, it is an app which you can play with, and you can see it on your phone or whatever, or on your computer, but if you go physically located in that place, in a way, in the forest, and you start the app in the forest, you end up having everything basically blooming around. Where is that? It was here. So basically, this is screen capture of the app running in the forest. So as long as you're in the forest, the entire nature kind of like is aware of your presence. Exactly, and changes season, basically, yeah. While if you're out, if you're in London, you're gonna get nice, just a simple kind of lookout as this one, or as what's happening here now.
I think it's gradually all about kind of building up towards this idea of a location-specific data set. So we worked with Hannah Durham, who is here as well, who basically came and helped us do some binaural sound recordings. So inside the app itself, you get these really immersive 3D sounds, and we went and did specific recordings, audio recordings from each of the locations that we scanned from, so that the birds that you're currently hearing now are the birds from the site. So all the animals and all the sound effects and stuff that you get are actually, the sounds from those specific location. Yeah, so this is the sound map. And what's also kind of interesting about it is that we started about 4 a.m. So before the sun had come up, down on the left-hand side, and then we worked all the way up to the top in about just over 4 hours, I think. And in that time, the sun came up and the birds kind of started waking up and all the rest of it. So you get, actually, when you play, although it's a snapshot in time, or it's a changing snapshot in time, you get a really kind of diverse audio landscape as well across the site. But I think it's really interesting that you can start to, it's similar and dissimilar at the same time to where we were starting to look at the ideas from the landscape project before, where you are working with live GPS data, where this is, although it's frozen data, it's still kind of, we've brought in that level of interactivity where you can explore the sound, so it's changing around you. So although the data is static, you're not anymore, if that makes sense. So we've kind of try to look at it in that sense.
Well, also each of if you were watching what Ollie was doing, playing around in there, but each of the animals, they have their own sort of territories, and they're sort of elusive. They're triggered by your movements, and they each as well have their own sound that they're emitting. So they're like these instruments that are running around, constantly changing the soundscape of what you're hearing. So yeah, I mean, kind of adding on to what Will was saying in terms of weaving quite a complex amount of different kinds of data into this one environment, and then being able to kind of explore that as something which is not, it poses itself as a game, but it doesn't really have the ambitions of a game, as in trying to get to the next level, or shooting something, but I mean you can kind of chase the animals forever till they glitch out. But yeah, I mean, it was that's why it was Datum Explorer. It was a space for exploration, for observation, but also as in the mobile version for actually like moving your own physical location somewhere else to find, a secret layer to it.
Yeah, but just to highlight that we are not a startup making games, which we came across once
we'll make more money
to somebody like, probably will make more money like that. But yeah, no, I think it is a self-initiated project which we worked in the afternoons over a couple of months. But we decided to invest the time in a self-initiated project because you don't have always the freedom to express what you have to say, basically, or to kind of explore what you're curious into on a commercial project. Sometimes applies, not all the time, and this was the kind of difference which I think everybody bumps into. But it's the same everywhere. As if you go in an architectural practice, you will bump into the same issues, as in like you need to subscribe to what your head of studio is telling you to design. It's always we find this balance which is between creativity and money, basically, which is if you want to have more input doing your random stuff, because in the end they are emotional random stuff, you have to let loose some of the income. If you want to gain some income, then you just need to do something that pleases the collective that you work with in a way. And I think that's the. It might sound harsh though, but I think it's a nice example of trying to adapt yourself basically to certain conditions in a way. And the point with Datum Explorer is that was the easiest way to take all this exploration of a landscape, read through digital tools and documented through digital tools, brought in the environment, brought into all the platforms available. I mean, this thing is basically running on everything you want it to run, more or less. I don't have a browser, I don't have a browser. So we have a little website of the project, which is datumexplorer.universalAssemblyUnit.com, from where actually you can download your version of Wheel. We have a web version, and there's an iOS and Android one coming for the mobiles, but that's something which, due to Apple development, which keeps you on queue for 3-4 weeks just to approve your app, so we were hoping to launch it today, but apparently it doesn't happen. It will happen sooner. But what we found more interesting about it, I think we didn't discuss too much about, is what's happening with the installation, basically. Maybe, Will, you want to say something about
Yeah, I mean, so the idea is that this project is really inhabited across multiple sites. It's not just this online version, it's also this very site-specific version. So with the point cloud, this kind of 3D point cloud virtual environment that we created, it allowed us to then essentially project this environment back onto the landscape. So you can see from some of these images that we basically set up a series of 3D projection mapped projectors, which were then in real time relaying this, the animals and the motion of the animals and the movement of the environment back into the site. So you were seeing the virtual tree, that exact same virtual tree being reprojected onto the same tree. And it was quite a weird kind of experience, and bizarrely most people were actually more interested in the screen version, the kind of behind the scenes. Although for us it was definitely much more interesting, the stuff that was coming out of the projector. Everyone's kind of kept coming and huddling up and looking what was going on and looking at all the kind of the camera setup and all the animals and stuff that were moving around. But there's something very nice about this thing working and behaving simultaneously. So you have this virtual rabbit running around, as well as this actual real rabbit in the forest, a virtual real rabbit in the forest. I shouldn't say real, I should say physical rabbit. Actually in the forest. So yeah, I mean, it's about really this exploration of telling stories in a non-linear fashion. A lot of the stuff we did to begin with, especially from school and stuff, was more the traditional kind of linear-based animations, where there's a start, a middle, and an end. And this is really starting to push us towards this idea of non-linear-based storytelling, where there is no kind of beginning or end. It's left up to individuals, whoever it is, to kind of really explore and shape the way that the story unfolds. So, I mean, the possibilities are literally endless, and that's why the app's kind of actually ended up being more developed than we initially planned it to be. It was built around this idea of the physical installation. But as we discussed, this tool as almost like a sand pit, as a bit of a dark hole of our time where we just kind of keep trying out new things inside of it. So yeah, I mean, we like to create projects that don't really have any sort of predetermined end state, but one that you kind of let curiosity kind of define.
Which is a bit dangerous, though. Yeah,
just let it grow again.
We still add to it and add, and where's the point where you say, okay, can you just stop with it now and just can you wrap it up somehow? But then you end up having, okay, how can we take this commercially? And we found a solution. And then how can we take this whatever strain in the game world, which game world is a different world than the architectural world, but they still need environment designers. But I think I think
that's why we kind of like the setup of the way we did the lecture, because it's a lot of the times it's the scrap stuff that you're doing, which you have on the side, that actually informs a lot of the direction of the project. So, I mean, I think that's generally a way of working that we follow, is that we kind of place a lot of value on the accidents that happen on the side and let it grow organically, just let it evolve.
Yeah. I think it's kind of like the animals in the forest, in a way that in the beginning they're almost like a placeholder of a designed digital world. I mean, the 3D assets were designed into a version of that, and we placed that kind of in there by accident, and people like it so much and react to it in real time, like projections. So we kept them, and they became a part of Datum Explorer.
Yeah, they were somewhat relatable.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We might end it on just a short film of that installation.
Don't tell them we handed it down.
Right?
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys, for a great lecture. It was really inspiring to see, I guess, how you converted all the ideas you were working on and kind of evolved them to form a kind of form of practice. Just to start off some questions, I'm really interested in this idea of this multi-platform experience, and I was wondering if you could speak more about that, and also in keeping with the What's Next theme, kind of how you guys came together to kind of form the practice. Like, it is quite a big risk to set up on your own, and you were mentioning like it was kind of in the beginning to start meet only on Monday afternoons. So I was just wondering, like, what was the decision you made, and how are you sure from graduation onwards that you wanted to do something quite different?
Well, I think the Monday came out just because it was the first day. It was horrible all the time, and we had to decide on a date which we could all put in the schedule for the feature and keep to that date.
It was evening, not afternoon.
Yeah, it was evening. Sorry, yeah, it was evening.
More like night.
There you go.
Late nights.
But I mean, I'll talk about the multi-platform thing a bit more, and I'll let them talk about the practice. The multi-platform thing, I mean, it's something which we fully engaged with and embedded with, and that's because we do have an architectural space, as we kind of refer to it sometimes, classic architectural space, as the one we live into now. But then there is a new space, which is I would roughly sketch it and call it web space in a way, which is a digital space that someone's mind could be transposed into and could be kind of explored after that. And then, as much as you say, okay, we design spaces and you design to build them, the process of designing a space for the digital medium is the same, basically, and the way to plan it and to build it to life is exactly the same thing. And as much as we all spend more and more time basically tapping and scrolling through that space, we think that's the audience, that's the space of the audience, which is curated by developers, which developers have no idea. Well, I wouldn't say have no idea, with all the respect to developers, but they don't think about any narrative to that space. And that was the point where we said, well, actually, the idea of multi-platform space is a space, and this is what we try to bring with the Datum Explorer, like how many of the spaces that we know about we can touch base on in a way. It is the physical space, the natural space, it is the digital space. And even into that is why we're looking into. We haven't done, a web version and a mobile version just to kind of tick the boxes, but that's because there are different sites in a way. The web is a different experience than your own computer, than your mobile app. And the mobile app, this is why we release it a bit later, because we put a lot of emphasis on it, because it has this character of being locative, of taking you out back into the real site in a way, and looping you back into the site specificity of the environment. It's like a massive diagram with all things interlocking and interlacing in between them. I think it's a great platform to deploy narratives and kind of get critical positions on.
Well, I think also, Manija, like you're probably very familiar with print and publishing, but it's across like all industries. It's I guess it's the same thing. Is there's this need to demand the attention of people online, and it not just become, a print is dying out. So I mean, especially with the stuff we were doing for Tank magazine, like they have a print, but there's online content which is embedded in each of the pages, which you can link to with an app. But that's sort of across any kind of industry, is that there's a need to exist have presence, and not just being on the web, but also physically, but not just being kind of, because everyone's attention is very scattered across all their screens and everything, it also needs to be attention grabbing. So, I mean, we do get a lot of people approaching us, not really knowing exactly what we do, but they look at the website and they go, yeah, we just want something kind of like that, like interact, like digital. And you're like, what do you mean? Right? But it's like, yeah, just take this and make it like do that. Something. Yeah, make it do that. Like, okay. So that's also kind of how the work started to shape and evolve as well, is also how we felt we could fit into different industries, whether it was in fashion or it was with music and performance or with print publishing, or, I mean, even with architecture though, which is something I think we would like to get more into, is, how does the actual built environment or the interior become something which is more interactive or more kind of reactive, I guess.
Yeah, I think what's quite nice is that although we kind of came from a similar background, the same unit from the same school, we do have quite different interests in a way. Although on the face of it, the work might seem quite similar, we bring, I think, quite diverse skills through all four of us. So there's lots of, the opportunity, like when we meet up on a Monday, often we end up not actually really doing much work at all, because we end up talking for about 4 or 5 hours straight before we realised that we were supposed to actually be doing something. And it's almost like just like bouncing these ideas off each other allows us to kind of, really kind of develop as a studio, rather than always trying to force these ideas. We've managed to keep up the Mondays anyway since we started, more or less. I think we've only missed a couple.
And this is a Monday too.
Yeah, exactly.
This is what we do.
You try to fit in with your format.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's important to mention maybe that we do run the studio, and that's kind of most of the time, but we're also freelancing individually with great studios which kind of support us and we work with. And I think it's interesting to be with other studios, and I mean, some of us, I won't say who, doing this part 3 basically, it being in a very clear architectural framework, and seeing what we're doing from that perspective is being seen in a way. Or in the same way, in the same way, what we develop, trying then to go back and implement it in those studios, it's quite interesting to see how they react to it, because it's totally different from what sometimes they expect, not all the time, but sometimes they expect to. I think it's an interesting kind of back and forth in a way between the two.
I mean, exactly. I think that there's a kind of new reality everyone's having to negotiate between the kind of physical and digital realms. And I think that's why I thought that the multi-platform experience thing was so exciting. But also, I think a big part of the series was so that students don't necessarily graduate and think they have to like run towards doing something pragmatic, but that they can find a way to continue the ideas they were exploring at the AA. And I think you guys are a really successful example of that, and how you've each taken your individual projects and found a way to kind of collaborate together and form some new work around that. I just wanted to open it up to anyone else if they had any questions. We can pass the microphone around.
They better have.
Anybody?
We said everything. We said everything.
Don't be shy.
Otherwise, I will ask a question.
Anna's got a
What's for
question.
dinner?
Wait.
What do you hope to do next?
Another project, or to finish this one. That's myself. Sorry.
The Data Explorer never ends.
No, well, the thing is, as you imagine, is like you have a block, right, that you start carving into. And you have all these bits that fall apart on the sides. And when you're done with your final piece, as final as you can consider it, that's something which you put aside, and then it's just a matter of like, you know, wrapping it and kind of put it out. But then you're left with all these debris in a way, which personally we always value more than I think they're valued. Because somehow the reason of eliminating those debris is something which doesn't make it fit in that context, but maybe it's a seed for another project in a way. So the biggest problem for us is basically to curate all those debris in a way. And of course, one way is, one thing which, with regards to the Datum Explorer, is to take the Explorer far away. You know? This is version 1, and that's version 1 tied to one site. But it is like how many sites can you embed with it, and how many sites can you explore with it. And then, there.
Well, and also to push the level of interactivity that you get in the physical environment as well with the installation. That you can actually have spatial triggers and then actually create a more collective experience. Because, I think that we sort of also want to start moving more towards installation and kind of exploring how we can explode the screen out into the world rather than always keep it confined to that. Although, we don't necessarily mind if it suits the project, but I think personally we do want to move in that direction.
And the other thing that keeps us busy is to make money out of this stuff.
Yeah, make lots of
It'd
money.
be nice to make some money.
Because you kind of need to sometimes. You have, the
We have
option.
to package it
Yeah.
like,
You have
in a
the,
commercial way, basically.
Yeah, because this project was basically driven by previous commercial projects, which then allow you to set back for a bit and develop it slowly, as fast as you can, but still in the time frame. But then, of course, it's like, how can you see the value that you love at it, but also how can you give it commercial value to it? And when I say commercial, doesn't mean it needs to sell as Coca-Cola, but you need to kind of like get a feedback and get the right purpose for it.
Yeah, it's not necessarily like about selling out or whatever, but it's about relating to a bigger audience. I think that's rather than our own AA little world.
Yes. Can you just wait for the mic?
I missed the first part, like 15 minutes maybe of the presentation. But what is your software, your workflow or your software platform like between the team? Do you do all the same
A bit
software?
of everything.
It's everything.
It is basically everything.
We kind of make that a rule in the studio that we don't use one tool because otherwise we just stick to it. So if the tool calls for it, we'll use it. We might use one thing, just use the trial license for that project, and it just expires by the end of the project, and it's cool.
And then you can't edit it again.
Yeah. So we're on lots of trials of different softwares.
So
Yeah.
all of you, like all 4 of you.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a matter of like kind of dipping or hearing about, and then like sharing with the other ones or teaching with the other ones, basically. And it's like, what's the we want to do this, what's the best way of doing that? And sometimes you're lucky to find great software pieces, other times you're unlucky and you end up smashing your head trying to write JavaScript or C# or whatever to develop that in a way, which we're not all aces at because we weren't trained as developers. But yeah, you kind of learn your tools, I think, on the way, which of course slows down the process, but then it gains a big lack of knowledge in terms of learning that tool. So we find it as a fair trade.
And two, what is your take on branding? Because, like feeding data into simulation engines or software, gives a lot of iterations, a lot of potential, but where is like the signature piece, or how do you deal with that? Like the top down, bottom up, I understand, but how are you going to deal with that, or you don't care about that?
You mean the branding?
In terms of design, like your design signature, digital.
Well, I think that kind of gets built in the process of the project in a way, because we always refer to it as a kind of a bridge starting from two sides, and you kind of need to match more or less. And if you don't match, you patch it a bit. But sometimes you match.
Yeah, I don't necessarily see ourselves as bottom up. We're not very generative as a studio. We use some of the tools, but I think we usually start out with a strong kind of creative direction about the project first. And then those generative tools feed into that afterwards. But yeah, I don't think the design process is necessarily choosing from thousands of iterations of it. No, it's quite specific.
Thank you.
Hope that answered.
Okay, well, if that's it, then I just want to thank you guys all for coming.
Thank you as well for inviting us.
Will and Zhan, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. If you're here tomorrow, Julia Foscari is coming as another What's Next lecture. So I hope you can join us for that as well.
Thanks.
Thanks, William.